In 1793, a king stood before a crowd in Paris. His crime, not tyranny, not cruelty, bankruptcy. Louis XVI lost his head because his grandfather's government made a choice: destroy Britain at any cost. They succeeded. Britain lost America. France lost everything else. This isn't a story about revolution. It's a story about what happens when nations spend money they don't have, on wars they can't afford, for victories that become their own destruction. The question isn't whether France could have avoided this. The question is, why didn't anyone see it coming? In 1770, France was the center of European civilization, the most populous nation in Europe, the cultural capital of the world. French was the language of diplomacy, philosophy, and sophistication. Paris glittered. Versailles symbolized absolute power. French military might was unquestioned. The French state appeared eternal, unshakable, beyond collapse. Every indicator suggested permanence. The institutions were ancient. The monarchy had survived centuries. The social order was rigid, yes, but stable. This stability created a dangerous assumption that the system could absorb any shock, sustain any expenditure, survive any crisis. People believed in French permanence the way people always believe in the permanence of established systems. Not because of evidence, but because collapse seems impossible until it happens. France's financial system had functioned for generations through a simple mechanism. The king borrowed, and creditors believed he would repay. This belief wasn't baseless. France was resource-rich, the population was enormous, agricultural output was substantial. The tax base, in theory, was sufficient. The crown borrowed through a network of financiers, tax farmers, and office holders. These intermediaries advanced money to the state in exchange for the right to collect taxes or hold positions. It was inefficient, corrupt, but functional. For decades, this system absorbed the costs of war, court extravagance, and administrative bloat, not because it was sound, but because creditors believed in the collateral, the wealth of France itself. Belief, not balance sheets, sustained the system. As long as confidence remained, money flowed. The moment confidence cracked, the entire structure would fail. In 1776, American colonists declared independence from Britain. France saw not a democratic uprising, but a strategic opportunity. Britain was France's great rival. Every French defeat in the previous century, the loss of Canada, the humiliation in India, the diplomatic isolation could be traced to British power. Here was a chance to break that power permanently. The logic was seductive: support the Americans, bleed Britain's treasury, tie down her armies and navies in a war across the Atlantic. If the Americans succeeded, Britain would be weakened for generations. Foreign Minister Vergennes championed the strategy. He convinced Louis XVI that this was France's moment, not to conquer territory, but to destroy British prestige and commercial dominance. So France opened the money tap. Initially, support was covert. Gold, weapons, and supplies flowed through fabricated companies and private channels. Playwright Beaumarchais became an arms dealer, funneling French aid to the Americans while maintaining diplomatic deniability. But covert support wasn't enough. In 1778, France formalized an alliance with the United States. Now the costs escalated: outfitting fleets, deploying armies, subsidizing the American war effort. The French treasury poured money into a conflict thousands of miles away. Ships, soldiers, munitions, loans, all without any mechanism to recover the costs. America promised eventual repayment, but those were promises backed by a government that didn't yet exist. France wasn't investing. France was burning money for strategic ego. In 1781, French forces helped secure the American victory at Yorktown. Britain sued for peace. The Americans won their independence. France had achieved its objective. Britain was humiliated, weakened, isolated. But the cost was catastrophic. France had spent approximately 1.3 billion livres on the American war, roughly equivalent to twice the annual revenue of the French state. This debt was added to the already substantial debts from previous wars. By 1783, debt service, just the interest payments, consumed more than half of all government revenue. Not roads, not defense, not administration, interest. Finance Minister Colony tried to explain the situation to Louis XVI. The state was borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing. Revenue couldn't cover expenses. The deficit was structural, not temporary. The king's response was to borrow more. New loans were issued at higher interest rates because creditors were becoming nervous. Each new loan made the next one more expensive. The spiral had begun. Taxation was politically impossible. French society was divided into estates: clergy, nobility, and everyone else. The first two estates were largely exempt from taxation. The third estate, peasants, artisans, merchants, carried the tax burden. Increasing taxes on those already overtaxed would provoke unrest. Taxing the privileged estates would require breaking centuries of tradition and challenging entrenched interests. So France simply borrowed. The financial system that had worked for generations began to crack. Creditors started asking questions. Could France actually repay? What was the collateral? Where would the money come from? When those questions have no good answers, confidence dies. France wasn't the first European power to discover that military victory can lead to financial ruin. Spain had learned this lesson over the course of 2 centuries. In the 1500s, Spanish silver from the Americas flooded Europe. Spain appeared invincible, the wealthiest empire on earth. But the silver financed wars across Europe, wars in the Netherlands, wars in Italy, wars against France, wars against the Ottomans. The costs were relentless. Spain defaulted on its debts in 1557, then again in 1560, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647. Each default destroyed creditor confidence. Each new loan came at punishing interest rates. By the 1600s, Spanish silver went directly to foreign creditors, bypassing the Spanish economy entirely. The richest empire in the world couldn't pay its bills. Spain didn't collapse because it ran out of money. Spain collapsed because it ran out of credibility. The pattern is identical. Borrow from military glory. Win battles, lose fiscal capacity, erode confidence, and discover that once creditors stop believing, the empire stops functioning. France watched Spain's decline. French ministers studied Spanish fiscal disasters. Yet when France faced its own strategic opportunity in America, the lessons were ignored. The belief that this time is different is the most expensive assumption in history. France's breaking point didn't arrive with drama, it arrived with silence. In 1787, Finance Minister Coligny proposed a comprehensive reform, a universal land tax that would include the nobility. He presented the plan to an assembly of notables, aristocrats, and church leaders whose approval was needed. They refused, not just the tax, but the premise that France faced a crisis. The notables demanded to see the accounts. When Coligny presented the figures, they accused him of exaggeration. Surely the situation couldn't be that dire. Surely this was political maneuvering. Coligny was dismissed. His successor, Loménie de Brienne, tried the same reforms. The notables refused again. The Parliament of Paris, a judicial body with the power to register royal edicts, blocked the reforms. So Louis XVI took an extraordinary step. He called the Estates General, a national assembly that hadn't met since 1614. This was an admission. The King of France, holder of absolute power, was confessing that he couldn't govern without consent. The financial crisis was so severe that the monarchy itself was asking for help. When the Estates General convened in May 1789, it wasn't a parliament, it was an autopsy. The Third Estate commoners declared themselves the National Assembly. They demanded a constitution. The monarchy, bankrupt and powerless, couldn't stop them. Confidence had evaporated. Not in the currency, not in the bonds, but in the fundamental belief that the French state could function. What followed wasn't inevitable, but it was predictable. The National Assembly abolished feudal privileges. They seized church property to back a new currency, the assignat. They issued more and more assignats, which promptly inflated into worthlessness. Bread prices soared. Urban mobs rioted. The monarchy became a symbol of the old, broken system. In 1792, France declared itself a republic. In January 1793, Louis XVI was executed. His crime, as stated in his trial, was not cruelty. It was betraying the nation through fiscal mismanagement and foreign entanglements. The American War, which had seemed like France's great strategic victory, was cited as evidence of his incompetence. France had bankrupted itself for a cause that brought no benefit to French citizens. The revolution didn't solve the financial crisis, it made it worse. The assignats collapsed. The economy contracted. Famine spread. The reign of terror began, partly driven by economic desperation, partly driven by the chaos that follows when institutions fail. By the late 1790s, France was governed by a military strongman named Napoleon Bonaparte. He stabilized the currency, centralized power, and led France into 2 decades of war that devastated Europe. The American War had been fought to weaken Britain. Instead, it weakened France so thoroughly that the entire European order collapsed. Looking back, it's tempting to imagine that better policies could have saved France. Smarter reforms, wiser ministers, earlier action. But every attempted fix failed for the same reason. The reforms required sacrificing entrenched interests, and those interests had veto power. Tax reform required making the nobility and clergy pay. They refused. Spending cuts required reducing military expenditures and court expenses. The king couldn't cut the military without appearing weak. He couldn't cut the court without alienating his own supporters. Debt restructuring required defaulting on creditors, which would destroy confidence entirely. Every solution required pain, and every constituency had the power to block the pain. This is the trap. By the time a fiscal crisis becomes undeniable, the political capacity to solve it has already eroded. The very debt that created the crisis also creates the paralysis that prevents resolution. France's ministers understood the problem. Coligny's analysis was accurate. Brienne's reforms were technically sound. But technical competence is irrelevant when the political system cannot implement solutions. The reforms didn't fail because they were wrong. They failed because failing systems protect themselves until they collapse. France's story isn't unique. It's a template. Across centuries, the pattern repeats. Nations borrow to project power, win their wars, then discover the cost of victory exceeds the benefit. The debt accumulates. The interest compounds. The political system becomes paralyzed. Spain learned this in the 1600s. France learned it in the 1700s. Britain nearly learned it after World War I, saved only by American loans. The Soviet Union learned it in the 1980s when military spending to compete with the United States hollowed out the civilian economy. The mechanism is always the same. Borrow for strategic goals. Assume future growth will cover the costs. Discover that creditors eventually want repayment, and strategic victories don't generate revenue. The question isn't whether this pattern exists. The question is whether it's visible in real time, or only in retrospect. Today, the world's largest economies carry debt levels unprecedented in peacetime history. The United States, Japan, China, and European nations have debt-to-GDP ratios that exceed the levels that triggered past crises. The justifications are varied: pandemic response, infrastructure investment, military competition, entitlement obligations. But the pattern is identical: spending without revenue, borrowing without repayment plans, assuming that credibility is infinite. France believed its credibility was infinite. Spain believed it. Every empire that collapsed financially believed it. Belief doesn't create reality, it delays recognition. The pattern has stages, and they're consistent across centuries. Stage 1. The strategic opportunity. A nation sees a chance to advance its interests through spending. The opportunity appears too valuable to decline. Stage 2. The initial success. The spending achieves its goal. The war is won. The project is completed. The strategy appears validated. Stage 3. The hidden cost. The debt accumulates in the background. Interest payments rise. But economic growth or new borrowing masks the problem. Stage 4. The failed reforms. Leaders recognize the problem and propose solutions. Political opposition blocks the solutions. The can is kicked down the road. Stage 5. The credibility crisis. Creditors begin to doubt repayment. Borrowing costs rise. The fiscal position deteriorates faster. Stage 6. The institutional collapse. The state can no longer function. Legitimacy evaporates. What follows depends on the society, but the financial system is already gone. France went through all 6 stages in less than 2 decades. The speed surprised contemporaries. In 1775, France seemed unshakable. By 1795, it was unrecognizable. This is the danger of pattern recognition. It only helps if people act before stage 5. By stage 5, the outcome is already determined. The system is just waiting to discover its fate. The strangest aspect of fiscal collapse is how long people deny it. French aristocrats in 1787 genuinely believed Coligny was exaggerating. They couldn't accept that the monarchy was bankrupt because bankruptcy was incompatible with their worldview. Spanish creditors kept lending to Philip II even after multiple defaults because Spain was the richest nation on earth. How could it truly be insolvent? This denial isn't stupidity. It's psychological protection. Admitting the system is failing requires admitting that everything built on that system is at risk: positions, wealth, status, identity. So people normalize the dysfunction. Deficits become standard. Debt levels that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier become acceptable. Borrowing to pay interest becomes routine. Each normalization makes the next one easier. By the time the crisis is undeniable, the capacity for shock is gone. People have spent years being told everything is fine when it's suddenly not fine. The cognitive dissonance is paralyzing. This is why revolutions surprise everyone, including the revolutionaries. The decline is visible for years, but invisible to those inside the system. The break, when it comes, feels sudden, even though it was decades in the making. There's a phase in every fiscal crisis where the most dangerous thing is the calm. France experienced this in the early 1780s. The American War was over. Peace had returned. The economy was growing. Paris was vibrant. Life continued. But beneath the surface, debt service was consuming the state. The deficit was structural. The political system was gridlocked. The crisis was already locked in. Yet to contemporaries, everything seemed manageable. The problems were technical, not existential. Surely smart people would find solutions. This is the silent phase, when the outcome is determined but not yet visible, when the trajectory is set but not yet acknowledged, when everyone knows something is wrong but believes it's fixable. The silent phase is where historians can see the collapse coming, but contemporaries cannot. It's the most frustrating period to study because the answers are obvious in retrospect and invisible in real time. The question is there a way to recognize the silent phase while inside it? Or is recognition only possible after the collapse? Louis XVI's execution wasn't about tyranny. It was about fiscal failure dressed as betrayal. France destroyed Britain's hold on America and destroyed itself in the process. The victory was real. The cost was catastrophic. The lesson isn't that nations shouldn't fight wars or pursue strategic goals. The lesson is that financial systems have limits, and those limits are invisible until they're crossed. Spain crossed them. France crossed them. Others have crossed them since. France believed its system was eternal. So did Spain. So did every empire that borrowed itself into irrelevance. Belief is not a strategy. Confidence is not capital. And when a nation burns money for power, ideology, or ego, the fire eventually reaches the foundation. The most dangerous moment isn't when the crisis arrives, it's the years before, when everyone believes it won't. Louis XVI didn't see the guillotine coming until it was too late to avoid. The question is, who else is standing in line, convinced their system is different?